let's also talk about real estate infrastructure in China. Like there was a boom, then it's falling down. What's really happening?
So this is what happened with the property sector, right? Somewhere around 2008, when the great financial crisis took place in the world, it also hit China. Everybody remembers that the United States, in response to that financial crisis, announced a $700+ billion stimulus package under Obama. But nobody really recalls that China also announced a massive $500+ billion stimulus package because they all felt the strain of that crisis. Where that stimulus money went into was largely real estate. Why did that happen? Because in China, the political economy is such that if I am a city's mayor or a provincial governor or a party chief, I'm going to be in office for a few years, right? The metric by which my political achievement is going to be judged is GDP growth. This used to be the case at that point of time, right? And as I deliver more GDP growth, I am a meritorious individual who's proven track record, and I go up the party ranks, right? So the difference is that Chinese politicians are bureaucrats and politicians of the same party. In India, bureaucrats are different from politicians. So anyway, so those individuals basically sought GDP growth. GDP growth is essentially a measure of activity in the economy. So when you got access to this money, the stimulus money, to stimulate employment, ensure GDP growth, the best place to do this was to build more. So you built all kinds of things. You built housing, you built useless projects such as big parks, which nobody is going to access. You built bridges on which nobody goes. You built massively beautiful fountains in places where there may be like 2,000 people living. So you have a brilliant, beautiful fountain there. You build cities in cities which nobody lives in and nobody is likely to live in also. Because you had the money, and for the political incentive was to build so that there is GDP growth. Now, whether that asset is going to be productive was not the concern of this guy who was in charge, because he knew that by the time this asset is created, I'm going to be promoted to my next job because I've demonstrated this growth. The problem is the next guys, right? The next guy came, he said, oh, okay, I have money, let me continue to build. So you ended up building a lot of inventory and a lot of vanity projects, which did not yield anything. So this was wasteful investment, right? And like this, the property boom sort of grew. And obviously when people are going to look at where am I going to save my money? Now, the Chinese are also big savers like us. So where are you going to save your money? You're going to park your money in the real estate sector because it's booming, like it's growing consistently. Because there's constantly money coming in. At a certain point of time, you can see that there's a bubble building because you have ghost towns around the country where nobody's living. In order to demonstrate further activity, in some places where you've built these beautiful towers, after some years, you destroyed these towers and you rebuilt them. Right? Because you wanted to create activity and employment. So public money is parked in that. There's a big bubble there. The government is worried that sooner or later this bubble will burst. And there will be political pushback because people will be on the streets. And of course, banks are leveraged because all this money is going through the banking system and it's going as loans to these developers. And if none of this is productive, at the end of the day, the developers will default on their loans. It'll come back to the banks. There'll be a run on the banks and there will be full public cry. So how do you deal with this challenge? It's a structural problem. You can't wish it away. The real estate sector accounts for anywhere between 25 to 30% of the Chinese economy. So in 2020, in the midst of the Chinese government decided that, look, we need to deal with this problem because there's a moral hazard here. How do we deal with it? They said, look, we are going to put these 3 red lines on developers borrowing money. That you need to demonstrate certain reserve capacity, you need to demonstrate certain viability. There were 3 specific lines that were put out. Only then can you borrow more money from banks. This immediately meant that the developers who had become used to easy money suddenly started facing a crunch. So a lot of property which was sold but not completed stalled. A lot of unsold property, people stopped buying because people knew prices will fall. So you ended up in a case of stagnation. And then subsequently, that stagnation led to companies failing because you could not deliver on projects, you didn't have access to capital. So this was a government-enforced process of slowdown. In order to deal with the moral hazard and in order to divert money away from the property sector into the manufacturing sector. Because from the Chinese government's point of view, the future of China is advanced manufacturing, intelligent manufacturing, green manufacturing. They need to focus on technology. So what you have seen over the last 3 years, and there are wonderful charts to show that every year, property sector investment falls by about 9-10%. Access to capital for developers falls by about 13 to 15%. Whereas the manufacturing sector investment rises. So banks are being incentivized to transfer money over there. Now the challenge is you can do this theoretically, but what it means is that it's eroding the wealth of your citizens, right? So if I am a 40-something-year-old who's bought one house, who's got a steady job, and who's got more savings, now suddenly because the economy is starting to slow down, I am worried whether my wage growth is going to be consistent. I was hoping that my investment in the property sector would give me wealth growth, but that's not going to happen now. In fact, I'm worried whether the wealth will even erode, forget growth. So I am likely to spend less. So there's a ripple effect of that decision that's taking place in the economy, which has led to deflationary trends in the economy. But that's the challenge with the property sector right now. So what did the government decide that, okay, we can't let this continue, but we cannot even go back to the old way because it's not feasible. Money will go into areas where we don't want it to go into. So in January this year, they said, we'll create a new real estate management mechanism. Under that mechanism, the central government said that local governments must talk to, so provincial and city governments must talk to developers, and they must create metrics on the basis of which you will identify and whitelist certain projects. So a developer may have 500 projects in a particular province, but only 20 may be whitelisted as viable because the houses are pre-sold, they need to be completed, or because part of the housing is pre-sold, or because there is greater potential of those that, project to deliver. So you will whitelist those, and banks must provide funding to support them. But whether those projects succeed is not our problem. So banks have to also do their own risk analysis, because central government is not going to say that if you failed, if the project failed because it was a whitelisted project, but it still failed, don't come to us and say, give us bailouts. We will not do it. So all of you have to take your own assessments, but you need to provide money to kickstart this process of particularly unsold housing or particularly pre-sold housing to be delivered. Also other housing that you think can be converted into affordable rental housing. Encourage them, do it. State-owned companies can buy those projects and they can provide them as affordable rental housing to these new people who are migrating to cities, and the government can subsidize them. So through these 3-4 mechanisms, we will start pumping money back into the system. So we're not going back to the same old way. That in the last 6 months has led to some investment, but nowhere near the scale that is needed to stabilize the real estate sector or to give people confidence that my wealth will not erode. So therefore, consumption is still down. The economy is still struggling. Whereas the government is basically trying to say, we'll try to manage this bomb as long as we can. In the meantime, we are hoping that our manufacturing investments will start paying off and people will be able to switch jobs. The economy's main drivers can switch, so that even if subsequently the property sector takes a big cut, it's okay. The losses won't be as large. But at least we'll enforce some discipline in what has been an extremely indisciplined sector for the last 15 years. So that in a nutshell is what's happening with the property sector.
And it has any relation with manufacturing?
So the relation is this, right? That if you had money, if you had 100 rupees as an investor, you would put them in the property sector because the returns are very high, right? Because you always knew that Beijing will not allow the sector to fail. Because if the sector fails, it has significant economic impacts. And if it has significant economic impacts, it will have a political impact on the stability of the government. So you will not allow it to fail. Now what you're seeing is that in a limited way, they're allowing things to fail, because they want that money to go into manufacturing. That 100 rupees, they want 70 to 80% of that to go into manufacturing and less to go into property, because property for them is unproductive asset and manufacturing is where the future economic growth will come. So it has that link, right? Where you're trying to divert capital forcefully by restricting the growth of the property sector.